Hello, Bible lovers from across the globe. When we come back, the question you all have wondered. We've got 4 of them in the Bible, but what actually is a gospel? For the last few centuries, many scholars argued that because the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were written for a distinctly religious purpose, it would really be wrong to think of them as biographies of Jesus. And sure enough, the Gospels are really not all that similar to what we think of as a modern biography. Take this one just as an example on Harry Truman. This one's over 700 pages long, and look at all the footnotes indicating the massive amount of documentary evidence that went into this. The author's drawn from Truman's letters, family papers, records from the early days of his political career, his career as a haberdasher, his presidential records. They consulted at least 6 earlier biographies on Truman, which contain interviews with relatives, friends, children, grandchildren, people who knew him in World War I, army buddies, and so forth. Then there are photos. There's a massive amount of research, in other words, that went into this biography, most of which has been carefully documented and sourced so that scholars can recover and trace these resources themselves. The Gospels are really not like that at all. And yet, pretty recent scholarship by Richard Burridge has found that while the Gospels are not much at all like modern biographies, they are actually quite a bit like ancient Greco-Roman biographies. Now here I mean biographies like Isocrates, the Evagrius, Philo's Moses, Tacitus's Agricola, or Plutarch's collection of biographies known as his Lives. These biographies resembled the New Testament Gospels in several crucial aspects. First was the length. They're all about the same length, around 8,000 to 15,000 words. Second was the creative arrangement of the stories. Some stories also taken from the hero figure's childhood, stories that foreshadowed aspects of the later life. The third point of similarity is much of the narrative is going to be devoted to the death of the hero, how he died, last words, requests. Now, of course, all the Gospels are similar in all these regards to Greco-Roman biographies too. They spent a lot of time on Jesus' last weeks on earth. Fourth, around 30% of the verbs have the hero as its subject, and another 15 to 30% are going to be embedded within the hero figure's sayings, speeches, quotations. So Burridge's important achievement here has not gone unnoticed. At a symposium for Pope Benedict's books on Jesus of Nazareth, which some of you have read, Burridge was actually the only non-Catholic to give a keynote address. But the point is here, the upshot, the Gospels really do bear a strong family resemblance to Greco-Roman biographies of the time period. But there's more we can say here, and we should say more, because the Gospels also bear an even stronger family resemblance to one another. In fact, the Synoptic Gospels are kind of like twin brothers. John's sort of like a first cousin. To illustrate this, let's take a look at the Synoptic Gospel brotherhood where it pertains to a story. Actually, a pair of stories here. And here I'd like to look at the controversy concerning the disciples picking grain on the Sabbath and the healing of the withered hand man. This is in Mark chapter 2:23 through 3:6 and parallels in Matthew and Luke. Now, it'd be good if you did, by the way, a careful comparison of these stories in your own synopsis or in a website like this one. Now, we'll use these stories as an illustration. So what do we see when we look at these? Well, several things. Number one, a very high rate of verbal agreement, of similarity in language. Now, of course, there's some differences in detail, but we can't miss the fact that the stories are very, very similar, upwards of 70 to 80% agreement in language. Some comparisons between Matthew and Mark, or Mark and Luke, or Luke and Matthew, in fact, will demonstrate an agreement of over 90% with other stories. Now, the stories are not always that similar, but it's rare, in fact, that you compare parallels between Matthew, Mark, and Luke and don't at least find at least 40% of rates of agreement. Now, okay, what else? Number 2, the stories follow a similar form. Indeed, upon a close synoptic investigation that's looking at Matthew, Mark, and Luke in parallel at the same time, we're struck not only by the profound verbal similarity between them, but also by the degree to which individual stories show up in very well-rounded form. All of the synoptic versions are in fact quite similar in language and structure. Now, like many controversy stories, this one too observes a familiar pattern. Jesus, or in this case his disciples, Jesus does something provocative. His enemies complain about it. They go to confront him, and he ends the controversy with some pithy one-liner that makes his enemies look ridiculous. Now, as a matter of fact, the one-liner is a little bit different in each of the records of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but these sorts of differences in detail still take place within a broader agreement in the structure of the story. Now, speaking of details, there are actually not that many of them in this story, which brings us to number 3. Stories are really pretty minimal in terms of extraneous details. When we look at the story of the picking of the grain on the Sabbath, we note at once that there are many, many questions that could be asked about this episode historically. Questions which the text of Matthew, Mark, and Luke decline to answer for us. We do not know, for instance, where this event happened. Was it in Galilee? Was it in Jerusalem? Was it in the Decapolis? Was it in some nearby town somewhere on the way? Maybe it was near Capernaum, where the healing of the withered man seems to have occurred, but the texts don't actually tell us this. And furthermore, we don't know how this picking of the grain came to be known to the Pharisees in the first place. Did they personally witness this picking of the grain, or did someone tattle on the disciples? We don't know. We don't know how much grain the disciples ate. How long were they out there picking? What time of day was it? What was the weather like? No idea. Evidently, these kinds of questions that we might wonder about in trying to reconstruct this event in our own minds just aren't essential to the story as the gospel authors have left it to us. Now, speaking of the story, now we go to number 4. The stories are portable within the gospel tradition. Another way of putting this is that this pair of stories, that is the healing of the withered hand man and the picking of the grain, once circulated independently from one another. Oh, how do we know that? Well, take a look at Mark's transition from the grain picking controversy to the Sabbath healing. We get the sense that these events might well not have been consecutive. Now in Luke, we're told that they weren't consecutive. The picking of the grain and the healing each take place on a different Sabbath, with an unspecified amount of time passing between them. In Matthew, by contrast, they run together. One event flows immediately into the next. So each of the evangelists stitches the two stories together, and in fact we know because of this that they are two stories, not because they occurred consecutively historically, but because they both involve Sabbath-related controversies. They're thematically related. Now, one upshot of this is we don't know at what point of Jesus' ministry these controversies took place. In Mark and Luke, they happen relatively near the beginning of Jesus' ministry as it's recounted there, where in Matthew, there's around 7 chapters of material that precedes the appearance of these Sabbath stories. So the stories can be arranged differently. They are, as one critic put it, like beads on a string, with the evangelist supplying the string and also the ordering of the beads. So anyway, okay, so they're portable in the Gospels. They could have shown up in many places in the narrative of Matthew, Mark, or Luke. They could have been the beginning, the middle, and the end. And this is probably true of most of the other stories in the Gospels as well. Now, Not every story in the Gospels is so portable. I don't think the evangelists could have written a gospel in which the baptism of the Lord happened at the end or the crucifixion happened at the beginning. No, the evangelists are going to be constrained at least a little bit by fidelity to the historical memory of the events as they happened. But given those limits, the order of the events and the stories as we find in the Gospels is going to be substantially the creation of the evangelists themselves. Now, that's an important corollary of portability. But there's another important corollary of portability. I like saying that. Number 5, the stories were told orally before they were written. Positing an oral tradition behind the Gospels stories best explains Numbers 1 through 4 that I just said, the verbal similarity, the formulaic structure, the well-rounded forms with minimal detail, the portability. The stories of the Gospels were told in the church orally before they were written down. You've probably heard of the oral tradition behind the Gospels. Well, this is why most scholars and churchmen from the last 2 centuries or so have been pretty convinced that there is an oral tradition. But there's a consequence of this oral tradition. If there was a period of oral telling behind each of these broadly similar stories, what we're looking at is not 3 separate eyewitnesses' accounts of one event. Yes, there very likely is an eyewitness or eyewitnesses who got the ball rolling originally, who converted this from an event to a compact little story about the event, but it's definitely not what a lot of Christians on the pews probably think, that these events were written down by eyewitnesses shortly after they occurred, more or less as if the witnesses were writing what they saw or what they remembered. Partly this is because, as we have observed, the telling is simply too economized and strategic to suggest a raw eyewitness account. Eyewitnesses, when they're telling stories unrehearsed, will frequently add random incidental details to the story, details which might easily expand the story to several chapters rather than several verses. Indeed, in the case of Sabbath debates, we might well imagine that controversies between Jesus and the Pharisees of this magnitude wouldn't really be resolved with one-line accusation and a one-line response. In fact, isn't it more likely that there were many things said, both by Jesus and his critics, with charges, countercharges, posturing, long-winded speechifying? We do indeed see disputes like this in John's Gospel, where arguments sometimes ramble on for several chapters. It really seems like what we have here is a streamlined or highly stylized version of what happened. We get the essence of the Pharisees' accusation, the essence of Jesus' response to the accusation, with no unnecessary details added, which would only serve to blunt the story's impact. Now, much like reciting any story publicly or telling a joke, the effect of the story and the punchline is ruined if the person telling it doesn't plan the delivery out in advance and avoid getting bogged down in the minutiae and meaningless details. That the Synoptic Gospels are almost generic at times in detail and shaping, indeed that they appear in these forms in stories, is one of the central insights of modern New Testament scholarship. This gets us into an area known as form criticism, or Formgeschichte in German. These forms were the way in which we find them written in the Gospels probably achieved their well-rounded shape through a repeated oral telling in the early church. But here now we're seeing it is an oral tradition that lies between the written Gospels and the historical events. And that besides that, some of the details are actually different as they're recounted from one Gospel to the next. So with this one question we have to wrestle with is how we assess the historical reliability of the Gospels given this. Okay, well that's another video. But here I should pose another question which will be even more pressing for this particular course. Given that these stories share broad similarities in structure and language amidst differences in detail, it seems really likely that the Gospels are interrelated. that Matthew, Mark, and Luke were all drawing this story from one single common source, while keeping the freedom to make minor changes to that source as they saw fit. Well, how are these Gospels related? This is the so-called synoptic problem, and that's one we'll get into in another video. But for now, let's review the stories in the Gospels, especially the synoptic Gospels. Those Gospels are not like modern biographies, but they are like ancient Greco-Roman biographies. And the Gospels themselves in the New Testament are similar with each other in language structure, and the stories that they contain are well-rounded and portable. Not only in that they can be positioned differently within their respective Gospels themselves, but that they were once told in an oral fashion independently of a written narrative structure. And the stories were told in the church in a way very similar to the manner in which they appear in the Gospels at the time those Gospels were actually written down. Okay, very good. You ready to take a little quiz to see how much of that you remember?